Science, in a nutshell, has saved our butts more than once. Whether we're talking about the discovery of penicillin or vaccines, or the harnessing of electricity and alternative forms of energy, we owe a lot to our innate curiosity and desire to explore the universe around us. Even though we've done our best to reap the positive benefits of new technologies and advancements, admittedly, science has always been a double-edged sword. While this may not be one of our most uplifting videos, we're hoping this countdown of recent scientific breakthroughs that could pose an imminent threat will at least open your mind to a number of important issues. Fusion. Although it had been conceived of earlier, it wasn't until the standoff of the Cold War that cold fusion, ironically, started to be taken seriously. Touted as the holy grail of energy, the premise behind it is that of a nuclear fusion reaction of two hydrogen atoms taking place at room temperature, unlike the hot nuclear fusion that occurs in our sun, or the nuclear fission that is caused by splitting atoms. This would redefine the way we think of cheap, affordable, and plentiful energy because it would allow us to harvest a much bigger output, but with much fewer side effects. One of the biggest players in the US military-industrial complex, Lockheed Martin, issued a press release in October saying they were developing a smaller-scale nuclear reactor that could be deployed on the back of a truck. Critics were quick to point out that such technologies are still a good decade away from being viable and that Lockheed Martin has been quite reluctant to offer any further details. But it does raise some interesting questions. For example, while cold fusion definitely seems like a great idea on the surface, and it would help alleviate some of our biggest environmental issues like pollution and reliance on fossil fuels, it could also present a whole slew of unforeseen problems, not the least of which would be giving terrorist organizations and rogue powers a new and terrifyingly easy way to harness nuclear power for their own ends. While a compact cold fusion reactor could power a small home, in the wrong hands it could just as well be used to extinguish a city, and the proliferation of nuclear weaponry could further destabilize the relationships between some of the world's superpowers. Keep in mind, as it stands, we're still lingering at 3 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock. Furthermore, if cold fusion does become a reality, one of the biggest inevitable consequences is that widespread, worldwide utilization of this technology would release a considerably large amount of radioactive waste. Forget global warming, this may lead to global mutations. Luckily, if the scientific community is right about the technology's feasibility still being a long way off, at least we don't have to worry about cold fusion being the end of the world. Number 4. Genetic engineering. People squirm when they hear the word genetic engineering, and for good reason. Flashbacks of Jurassic Park notwithstanding, more often than not we simply can't predict the consequences of fiddling around with genes. One recent area where this has become an issue has been in politics. Back in 2012, Congress was actually looking at trying to engineer specific molds and fungi to wipe out the drug crops of other countries, in particular the poppy fields in Afghanistan and the coca fields in Peru, where the plant is perverted from its traditional usages and turned into cocaine. Back in the US, there are other efforts by Florida's Office of Drug Control to try and stem the illicit marijuana plantations in the states by releasing a variety of soil-borne fungi that could localize and target specific crops. Obviously, this sounds like a great idea on the surface, until you recall the Jurassic Park paradigm again. Biological systems, unlike electronic or digital systems, are susceptible to their environment and constantly changing and adapting. Sure, a herbicidal fungi might wipe out an invasive species or illegal drug plantation, but environmentalists and scientists alike are very wary of the unintended side effects of releasing a genetically modified killer into the wild. We've already seen how many biological organisms like bacteria can evolve in such a short amount of time, rendering our ability to control them useless. As Jeff Goldblum's character famously iterated,
life finds a way.
For example, if this fungi finds its way into normal cultivation, it may wipe out all our traditional food crops, and don't even get me started on genetic engineering of animals. That's like quite literally opening up a whole new tin of mutant worms. Number 3. Weather control. This is one example of a cultural universal, meaning that it is something all human cultures worldwide have attempted. And while most people love lightning storms, recent studies have prompted more questions than answers. It wasn't until the early 2000s that scientists were able to conclusively prove that lightning, in fact, created very intense X-rays, the same sort of radiation that is used in hospitals and dentist offices. Because X-rays have a very limited range, there's little chance of dangerous exposure unless you're a storm chaser or Benjamin Franklin. But one of the more recent studies out of the University of Florida posited the idea that one day they might be able to predict or even control where and when lightning strikes. While this could have an upside in terms of being able to harness natural electric power or help avoid forest fires, as a weapon it would set a terrifying precedent. Not only would organizations or countries be able to attack other countries from a distance by turning their own weather against them, but it would also be virtually untraceable. Which brings us to HAARP. Situated in Alaska, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program has been the subject of as many conspiracy theories as Area 51, and for good reason. Their original mandate was to study the behavior and effects of the ionosphere as they related to communication. But many gung-ho conspiracy theorists have alluded to their role in secret government experiments aimed at controlling weather patterns, even going so far as to claim they have the ability to cause tsunamis and earthquakes, and that a large body of their research has been aimed at producing electromagnetic pulse weapons. And while this has largely been disregarded as conjecture, HAARP has admitted they have tested strong electromagnetic pulses on the ionosphere. Because EMP completely fries electronic circuits, a big enough surge directed at the Earth from orbit, say from a satellite, could conceivably wipe out every computer network on a continent, erasing bank records, servers, and everything else stored on a digital device. In essence, send us back to the Stone Age. Number 2. Artificial Intelligence. Admit it, you're probably worried about a proverbial robot takeover of humanity at some point in your life. With movies like AI and Terminator, there does seem to be an embedded paranoia about technology in our culture. Although the creation of a fully recognized artificial intelligence that is self-aware is only a pipe dream at this point, that doesn't mean the issue of sentient technology hasn't been floating around in the brains of some of our smartest thinkers. This includes Stephen Hawking, who's gone on record saying that he thinks AI poses one of the greatest threats to humanity. There is a sort of ambivalence about artificial reality, and for the most part we seem to have embraced it, so long as it serves our needs and makes things more convenient. We play chess games against our computer, and we depend on Siri on our iPhones to keep our lives organized and answer our questions. These are relatively benign applications of the technology, but what about applications that aren't benign? Enter the MQ-9 Reaper drone. Ever since Barack Obama became president, the shape of warfare has changed dramatically, with more and more of it being automated, and the Reaper drone has become a staple of the US military. This year, however, researchers at the Air Force Research Labs developed a new AI called Alpha, which could be installed into a Reaper, and from the latest tests, it's a game changer. Most AIs can compete with human intuition and responses when it comes to live-action simulations of combat, but Alpha was able to predict outcomes and beat human players repeatedly. While this is great news in terms of reducing the risk to pilots, it does beg the question, if AI ever does become self-aware and can think for itself, will it see us as a friend or foe? And do we really want to take the risk of putting them in our most lethal killing machines? Suddenly, Skynet doesn't seem quite so far-fetched. Number 1. Nuclear mutants. The only thing more pervasive than our infatuation with a robot apocalypse is the mutant apocalypse. There must be something about Florida that invites disaster, because the Miami-based Turkey Point nuclear reactor is actually situated on over 20,000 acres of a pristine marshland conservation area. Yes, you heard right, a nuclear power company is also the warden for some of the highest populations of the American crocodile. And while they should be lauded for their efforts in supporting and maintaining a healthy ecosystem for these creatures, it positively reeks of the opening credits of a Godzilla movie. While worrying about a mutated horde of sharp-toothed reptiles being unleashed is probably pretty far down the list in terms of realism, they wouldn't be the first green-skinned gamma-eradicated monsters to come out of America. Like any tool, the effects of science depend more on who's wielding it than on the actual breakthroughs or discoveries they make, and if anything, it demonstrates the need for skepticism and caution when blindly adopting new technology.